Welcome to episode 15 of the P2P Connects Us podcast. I'm your host, John Light, and on today's episode, we're going to be talking about Uber's legal troubles in Europe and Asia, Uber and Lyft drivers facing recategorization in the US, the Evolution exit scam, AB 1326 update, and last but certainly not least, Slepak and Scott Santen joined the show to talk about basic income. Hello, and welcome once again to episode 15 of the P2P Connects Us podcast. Today's episode is brought to you in part by the OK Turtles Foundation and bitseed.org. The OK Turtles Foundation is a nonprofit dedicated to supporting beneficial decentralization technology. Current development projects include DNS Chain, a blockchain-based replacement for domain registrars and certificate authorities that underpin all of the internet security. Blockchain ID, a blockchain-based replacement for the centralized login systems offered by Google, Facebook, and other online services. And the OK Turtles browser extension, a messaging app that uses DNS Chain and Blockchain ID to enable man-in-the-middle proof end-to-end encrypted communication across almost any website. The OK Turtles Foundation is going to be launching a crowdfunding campaign to fund the integration of DNS Chain with the OpenSSL library so that any program that supports OpenSSL can also support DNS Chain. You can subscribe to the OK Turtles newsletter at okturtles.org to be alerted when the crowdfunding campaign begins. You can also donate to support the work of the foundation with Bitcoin, credit, or debit at okturtles.org/donate. Bitseed is a new company that is focusing on selling hardware that supports the decentralized internet. Their first product is the Bitseed Bitcoin Edition, a plug-and-play Bitcoin full node that makes it super easy for developers to start developing Bitcoin applications and for regular Bitcoin users to support the Bitcoin network by running their very own full node. By running a full node on your own dedicated hardware, you not only ensure continuous uptime to support the network, but you also free up computing power on your own desktop or laptop for other applications. You can order your own Bitseed Bitcoin full node at bitseed.org/shop. Big thanks to these organizations for supporting P2P Connects Us and working hard to create a more peer-to-peer world. You can also support this show by becoming a patron of the P2P Connects Us Patreon campaign. All patrons who send me a copy of their Patreon receipt along with a Bitcoin address from counterwallet.io are eligible to participate in my LTB giveaway program. This past weekend, 31,086 LTB coin and change were given away to 5 patrons of the P2P Connects Us Patreon campaign who sent in their counterwallet addresses. If you'd like to become a patron and participate in the giveaway, you can find the full details at patreon.com/P2PConnectsUs. I'm happy to announce that as of this episode, I will be participating in the BIG Patreon Creator Pledge, which was first started by today's guest, Scott Santens. BIG stands for Basic Income Guarantee, and as a participant in the pledge, I am pledging to give every dollar over $1,111 in pledges made to me to other creators on the Patreon platform who take the BIG Patreon Creator Pledge. Stay tuned for the second half of this episode to learn more about Scott Santens and the Basic Income Guarantee. I really appreciate all the support I get from P2P Connects Us listeners and like to support you back. If you're working on a peer-to-peer project or use peer-to-peer philosophy or technology to improve your life, write me your story and I'll share it on the show so the audience can learn more about how peer-to-peer ideas can be valuable to them. Lots of great stories and interviews have been featured on the show thanks to input from the audience, so keep them coming. P2P Connects Us is also accepting original or open source content to publish on the website. I'm paying 50,000 LTB coin for high-quality videos, 25,000 LTB coin for audio content, and 15,000 LTB coin for written articles. All original work that is published will be released under a copyleft license so that it's free to remix and redistribute as long as any derivatives or copies are also released copyleft. If you're interested in sharing your own perspectives on peer-to-peer philosophy, technology, and culture, please contact me through the contact page on my website at p2pconnects.us. You can follow the show on Twitter at P2P Connects Us, subscribe to the P2P Connects Us YouTube channel and SoundCloud page, and sign up for email alerts each time new content is posted on the P2P Connects Us blog by entering your email address in the sign-up form at p2pconnects.us. With those announcements out of the way, let's move on to the news. Our top story comes to us from the BBC, who are reporting that the ride-sharing company Uber is facing legal challenges throughout Europe and Asia, including a ban in Germany of their Uber Pop service, a raid by police on their France headquarters in Paris, and criminal charges of quote-unquote conducting an illegal business in South Korea. Each incident centers around concerns that the company is connecting quote-unquote unlicensed drivers with passengers. Police in South Korea say, quote, Uber Korea took 20% of passengers' taxi fares as commission and paid the remainder to drivers. One rental car firm made 96 million won, or about 58,000 pounds in 3 months, officers claimed, unquote. So for the heinous crime of creating new jobs for drivers and making local entrepreneurs over $70,000 in 3 months, 29 people, including Uber CEO Travis Kalanick, now have warrants out for their arrest in South Korea. People don't typically think of taxi regulations as acts of tyranny by the state, but look at the effect on Uber. 46 of their employees in Paris were terrorized by 30 police officers who broke into their office and stole all of their electronics. Uber customers in Germany are completely barred from using the Uber Pop app, and the company has to pay tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees to attend numerous court cases. And nearly 30 Uber employees in South Korea now face arrest if they even step foot in the country. What's next? Extradition? One thing is certain. A decentralized, truly peer-to-peer alternative to Uber can't be built soon enough. Uber also faces legal challenges here in the US as well. In San Francisco, 2 federal court judges have said in 2 different rulings that juries will have to determine whether drivers for the ride-sharing companies Uber and Lyft are legally classified as independent contractors or whether they are employees. These 2 companies are each facing separate class action lawsuits from drivers who, quote, contend they are employees and entitled to reimbursement for expenses including gas and vehicle maintenance. The drivers currently pay those costs themselves. Unquote. Should these juries find that the drivers are indeed employees, the consequences could be disastrous for not only Uber and Lyft, but other companies with similar business models as well. These companies would not only have to raise their prices to cover Social Security, workers' compensation, and unemployment insurance, but would also have to pay all of these costs retroactively for their drivers. This would be a huge hit to the company's valuations and competitiveness in the marketplace. These legal cases are just one more example of how difficult it can be to classify new peer-to-peer models according to old regulatory models. Just as companies and investors in the cryptocurrency industry are dealing with regulatory and tax issues regarding whether cryptocurrency is classified as a currency or as personal property, so too are sharing economy companies now dealing with similar issues regarding whether the peers providing services on their platforms are independent contractors or employees. This particular case seems pretty cut and dry to me. After all, the drivers set their own hours and are only given basic guidance regarding how they should interact with customers. But if the juries actually ruled that the drivers for Uber and Lyft are employees, it could be a catalyst that's needed for even more decentralized solutions which unambiguously place peers in the independent contractor category. If peers instead have to choose their own insurance, reputation rating service, and marketplaces, then sharing economy platforms can make a small amount of fees simply by providing discovery services so that buyers and sellers of different goods and services can find each other. It would be like eBay, where it's clear that the sellers aren't eBay employees, but independent merchants who simply use eBay's platform to find buyers for their products. If someone finds a way of combining an open source, decentralized marketplace platform like OpenBazaar or Bitmarkets with GPS and an algorithm to match drivers and riders, then the days of Uber and Lyft's dominance in the marketplace might be limited regardless of the outcome of these lawsuits. I really hope that the jurors in these cases have enough common sense to see that the drivers are clearly independent contractors. But if not, I'm still looking forward to a future peer-to-peer economy that is independent of heavily centralized platforms like Uber and Lyft. Another recent event that is sure to drive the evolution of decentralized marketplaces is the closing of Evolution, a darknet marketplace that was believed to be the largest successor to the first Silk Road. In a thread on the darknet market subreddit entitled, "Evolution Admins Exit Scamming," that's an all caps title for you, Redditor and former Evolution staff member NSW Great warns others about a possible exit scam, only to confirm their suspicions a few hours later. On March 17th, 2015, the Evolution marketplace and forum servers went down, never to come back online. The two admins, known as Kimball and Verto, stole an estimated $15 million worth of bitcoins from their customers, both buyers and vendors who had their coins held in wallets or in escrow. This theft was likely a major reason, if not the reason, for the fall in the price of Bitcoin over the past week, which dropped from over $290 to as low as $250 in the days following Evolution's closure. Many people in the Bitcoin forums online are questioning why more people didn't protect their funds using Evolution's multi-sig service. I find myself asking the same question. Given the history of marketplace malfeasance and takedowns, it's shocking that so many people left themselves completely vulnerable to the classic exit scam. Was the system too hard to use? Did they not know any better? Was it a honeypot to begin with? Regardless of the reasons why so few people used Evolution's multi-sig service, people are still pushing for marketplaces to go beyond multi-sig and become fully decentralized. The OpenBazaar team published a blog post just days after the scam entitled, "Evolution Exit Scam Shows Multi-Sig Isn't Enough. We Need Decentralization," in which they elaborate on the benefits of decentralized marketplaces. From the OpenBazaar blog post, quote, 1. Markets are persistent. There's no central point of control that can be taken down, either by outside actors or internal ones. 2. Funds aren't centrally controlled. There's no central authority to trust and no jackpot to steal. Individuals control their funds directly and likely use multi-sig for transactions. 3. No fees. Trade occurs directly between parties. There's no site operator to take a cut. 4. No data aggregation. Site operators and data thieves profit from aggregation of data on centralized systems, but there's no single trove of data on a decentralized system. 5. Trust and reputation are dynamic. In a centralized system, you are forced to trust the site operators, and the reputation system is static, as determined by site operators. In a decentralized system, you aren't forced to trust any parties, and reputation systems can emerge without any control or censorship by central authorities. Unquote. Worth noting is that OpenBazaar is not the only decentralized marketplace out there. On episode 13, I featured an interview with Steve DeCourt of Voluntary.net and lead developer of BitMarkets, a decentralized marketplace app for OS X that doesn't require a third-party arbitrator or a reputation rating system, instead relying on game theory using two-party bonded escrow to ensure good behavior on the part of buyers and sellers. While the Evolution exit scam was a deplorable act, and I feel terribly sorry for all of the innocent people who lost bitcoins there, I am heartened to see the community rallying around decentralized solutions and hope that innovation continues in this space and that projects like BitMarkets and OpenBazaar are well funded and maintained for years to come. Finally, I'd like to give you an update on the petition I published online last week in response to California State Assembly member Matthew DeBabney's BitLicense bill, AB 1326. The good news: I've gotten over 60 signatures from fellow Bitcoiners in California and abroad who wholly oppose the bill, with some interest in pursuing this fight to the bitter end. The bad news? The bill hasn't been withdrawn yet. The BitLicense is still on the table in California. At the last Buttonwood SF meetup, I laid bare the consequences of this bill should it pass and become law, and also our options for opposing it quite clearly. If the bill passes, Buttonwood SF and many other Bitcoin businesses in California will have to shut down. To oppose the bill, there are two paths that we can take. One which I'm calling the political path, and the other, the math path. The political path entails more lobbying of both Assemblymember Dababney and other relevant representatives in the state assembly, along with potentially more aggressive tactics such as placing pressure on Dababney's campaign financiers and political allies. The math path is a little bit cleaner and entails using technology to route around any damage this bill could cause should it be passed into law, including further developing decentralized exchange technology such as the BitSquare software featured in episode 10. Unsurprisingly, both I and many of my fellow Buttonwood SF members prefer the math path. At the same time, I recognize and am disheartened by the fact that if AB 1326 were passed into law, people who continue to trade Bitcoin in California without a license will face serious criminal penalties, such as the 4-year prison sentence. 4-year prison sentence handed down to John Powell in Illinois simply for selling Bitcoins without the appropriate paperwork. While a decentralized exchange would make it less likely for people to get caught, stings and raids would still be a possibility, and as I said in an interview with Forbes on this very subject, if it turns into an act of civil disobedience to trade Bitcoin at Buttonwood, I would question if that's the type of world I want to live in. If AB 1326 passes, that's exactly the world that all Californians will be living in. I intend to keep the petition posted online and will be sending copies along with everyone's comments to all of the relevant assembly members at the end of this month, regardless of how many signatures it has. If you support the free trade of Bitcoins, please sign the petition and support decentralized exchange software which can help preserve our freedom to trade even under authoritarian regimes such as the one being proposed in California. Thanks a lot to everyone who has supported the petition so far. For Let's Talk Bitcoin listeners, it's time for the magic word. The magic word for today's episode is freedom. That's FREEDOM. Freedom. You have 1 week from the time this episode is published on letstalkbitcoin.com to redeem the magic word for your share of the weekly proof of participation points and LTV coin distribution. Back to the show. I would like to welcome to episode 15 of the P2P Connects Us podcast, Greg Slepak and Scott Santens. Greg was a guest on episode 4 of the podcast and is joining us today as a guest host. Scott is a leader in several communities which advocate for basic income, which we're going to be learning more about today. Thank you both for joining the show.
Thank you.
John.
Happy to be here.
Scott, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got interested in basic income?
Sure. My background is actually pretty various. I've been a freelancer, so, website design, graphic design, writing, a bunch of different things. So, I've been a long time user of Reddit, and, before that, Dig, but I came over to Reddit, and at one point in late 2013, something made it to the front page of Reddit that was basically about how unaware people are about how advanced technology is at this point, that the stuff that we think of as science fiction years ahead in the future is actually happening right now. And in that thread on Reddit, there was a link to Marshall Brain's Mana saying, you guys should read this. So I read that, and that really got me thinking. And Marshall stuff too. I also recommend Robotic Nation, his 3-part essay. And in this, he talks about a basic income. He actually really sets the bar high, and he says that we should and can do something as high as like a $30,000 a year basic income. And that may sound kind of crazy to think, let alone of free money for everybody, but also of something to that amount. But if you read into it, it's got some very good examples of how to come about this money and just all the ways in that we aren't raising revenue already and how we could raise revenue, and basically as a means to leverage the technology. that we've developed and are continuing to develop to benefit everybody instead of just a select few. That really got me past this idea. I mean, it just seems something that once you hear about, you might kind of think of as a little bit crazy at first possibly, but once you really start to dig into it, it just makes so much sense that it just becomes seemingly incredibly important that this is something that we not only get going in the future, but something that we should already have. And when we do that, we can actually remove the brakes that we're putting on ourselves from more automation than what we're already seeing.
Thank you for that explanation. One of the first questions that comes to my mind, at least, and I'm sure it comes to other people's minds, is where does the money to pay for a basic income program come from?
Yeah, it's a very, very common question, and there's a few ways of looking at this. For one, we're already spending a lot of money on our current, and if you look into it, entirely broken and horribly ass backwards welfare system. And if you look at even the current taxes and transfers, like people will say, oh, how ridiculous is that to tax the rich and then give it back to them? Well, again, we're already doing that too. We're on average taxing and transferring about $10,000 per income quintile. So right now, the rich receive about $10,000. The richest 20% receive about $10,000 per year in transfers. Of course, these transfers are in a different form than we kind of imagine them as being for the poor. So it's more like subsidies and stuff like that. It's not so much cash assistance, but it's still cash assistance, and they're getting this, and so is everybody else. They're getting this already too. So there's already a lot of money that's being taxed and transferred that would just make far more sense to make visible and give as everyone to cash. So no more subsidies, no more deductions. Close all those, close all the loopholes, simplify the tax system, and just give people cash. So that's actually a way of saving a lot of this money.
Mm-hmm.
So they say, okay, this is going to cost like $3 trillion. Well, it doesn't cost $3 trillion. If we subtract everything that we're already doing and roll these programs into it, it costs somewhere more like an additional $1 trillion. So that's a lot smaller than what people usually talk about.
Mm-hmm.
Now, on top of that, so where do you come up with the extra trillion is the question. And this also involves, okay, so where is this money coming from? Like people will say, okay, well, this is coming from the rich. It needs to come from the rich. And, that's true. That's where the money is. But it's not so much the incomes of the rich. It's also can be, why do they have so much? Why do corporations have so much? Why is it that corporations are actually responsible for about half of the taxes that they used to do, back in the day? Where's all this money going? It's all going overseas. It's being held, tropical islands, it's just being hidden. The question also is, how do we get this money from them at the top, and why do they have so much? A good way of looking at this, I think, is Alan Watts has this great talk. You can look it up on Google. Just Google like Alan Watts, Money, Guilt, and the Machine. And in this talk, he talks about how you've got all this technology, and at some point, it's eliminating so many jobs that you're going to get to the point where you have to give people money in order to afford what the robots are making. Like machines are making stuff. And if they're taking the jobs, then in order for a consumer society to function, we have to give people a non-labor income. So the question is, where does the money come from? Well, it comes from the machines. The machines are what's creating all of this, or not all of it. It's creating a large amount of this inequality towards the top. Over the decades, we've seen more and more money become concentrated at the very top. And it's concentrating largely in part because of technology and globalization. And these things go hand in hand. So think of it as a car manufacturer. So let's say, look at Ford versus Tesla. Ford had hundreds of thousands of employees. Tesla doesn't. They just have hundreds or thousands. Like it's a much smaller amount, and they've got a lot of robots. It's really interesting to look at pictures of the Tesla factory, and it's just robots after robots after robots. So what happens there is that these are robots that are working there instead of machine. It's robots instead of people, and that's great. I mean, we want robots to work instead of people. But the thing is those robots aren't owned by everybody. They're owned by just a small percentage. So it's essentially that you've got a small group of people that are growing in equivalency to more and more total workers, and all the money is going to them instead. So the question is, how do you get at this? How do you shift this so that the benefits of technology are spread out more among everybody instead of just one small percentage at the top? It's a big point of this, of basic income.
Excellent. Well, thank you for explaining that. Greg, do you have any follow-up questions to that?
I do. The robots thing is actually interesting because you said that there are these robots producing value, and it's somewhat unfair that there's almost like a monopoly on robots. A very small percentage of people are able to benefit from this value, and it sort of feeds this cycle of the rich getting richer. But what sort of solution do you envision? Like, is there a robot tax, or what do you have in mind?
Yeah, so it's a good question. It's some people will say, well, we can't just have a direct robot tax. I mean, yeah, you don't want to tax what we want. So, you don't want to say every robot costs a certain extra amount, because then all people will be like, well, let's choose human workers. So that's a tricky thing. You don't want it to come directly from robots. Like if Applebee's buys a bunch of iPads, then you shouldn't be an extra tax on those iPads for the replacement of these workers. But you want to get at this revenue in a way that makes sense. So what I like is Peter Barnes just came out with a book about dividends for all. This is looking at the Alaska model. And I don't know if you're familiar with Alaska's annual dividend, but this is a dividend created from royalties on the oil that's owned by Alaska and is therefore considered the commonwealth of all residents of Alaska. So what I believe we should be doing is applying that model in a lot more areas. So instead of just oil that is considered commonwealth, it's a lot of other stuff. It's water, it's our air, it's even big data, it's pollution. There's so many different things that we can consider as all of us owning. So it's not so much a tax that we should be looking at. We charge a rent on the stuff that everybody can be considered as owning. And that would actually generate a whole lot of revenue. We're looking at about $5,000-$6,000 a year purely from that kind of setup. So you combine that with your elimination of current programs, and you've got yourself a basic income.
So it sounds like one source of revenue for basic income doesn't really directly or even very much indirectly robots per se, but it sounds like maybe, correct me if I'm wrong, the purchasing habits of the wealthy who benefit. Are you saying that that they will be spending their money on other things, and those other things like land, air, whatever it may be, that can be the source of revenue?
Yeah, so essentially it's not taxing the after profits, it's reducing the profits that they get through charging fees for corporations in order to use this stuff. So in a way, it's reducing their profits, but it's before instead of after. And that makes a big difference. In Norway, they charge about, it's a 50% royalty on the oil that they get up. That in order charge an oil company 50% in order to get that, and also did additional 28% for corporate taxes. And the companies still do it because there's still so much profit to be made. So the difference in Norway, everybody gets to benefit from the oil that's being drilled up from these oil companies, versus in the U.S., except for in Alaska. In the U.S., all these oil companies are just getting massive amounts of profit, and are even leveraging loopholes and so that they can pay $0 in taxes, like on and stuff. I mean, so it just makes far more sense instead of letting them help lobby for laws, get out of these taxes. We just charge them up front. Say, hey, if you want the oil, then you got to pay everybody in the U.S. a percentage of what you dig up, because it's all of our oil and not just yours. You didn't create it. You are adding value by taking it out of the ground, but you did not create the oil. So therefore, it just makes sense that they should pay a small fee for getting at it.
That makes it clear. Thank you.
Doesn't increased automation bring consumers lower prices? That's
another common argument, is to think about price deflation through automation, and in a lot of ways it does, but in a lot of ways it also looks at what's going down in prices. There are certain things, like say washing machines, computers, stuff like that, cheaper, but they still do cost money. I mean, all of this technology just costs money. Like a 3D printer, that's going to be great that people are going to be able to create their own goods through printing them. Need some shower curtain rings, print those. Need a screwdriver, print that. There'll be all sorts of things that we could print, but the technology itself, it still costs money to build. It costs money to get the plastic that we can make out of these things. So technology that is very powerful, it can do a lot of great things, but there's still an amount of money that people need. That actually takes me to I really want to talk about the peer-to-peer ability of basic income, and I think that leads right into it.
First, I would ask, what does peer-to-peer mean to you?
Well, I really like thinking in the terms of systems thinking, systems theory, and there's just such a big difference between looking at, say, a bunch of trees and seeing a forest. There is so much more going on with all these individual trees that there's emergent phenomena through the forest. Peer-to-peer, the internet, when you're looking at nodes in a network, our brains, our neurons, we're so much more than just a bunch of neurons. And we're so much more than this because of all the connections between those neurons. With the internet, I mean, it's all just a bunch of connected computers. But look at all the stuff that's emerging from the internet. I mean, there's so much more that happens as emergent phenomena from systems. And, we want that. We need to empower the nodes of a system for the system to work better. As far as what I was talking about with peer-to-peer and basic income, people like to say that, they hear about basic income for the first time and they'll think, oh my gosh, that's communism. And, of course, then you have to get into definitions between, say, state capitalism and communism and all this other stuff. But their thinking is that this is somehow a greater control of the market. But it's actually the opposite of that. This a basic income means that there's so many more members of the total system. There's so many more nodes in the network, so to say, that actually can voice signals. And that's what you want, is you need every node in a network to be able to signal. So if you've got a network of, say, 300 million people, and say, tens of millions of them have no means of connecting to the other nodes in the network, you're going to have a weaker network. By actually expanding that, and in our case, it's money is what provides the signal. By providing a larger amount of money at the bottom, so that everybody in the network actually has a minimum amount of voice in order to signal, then all of a sudden you've got a better functioning, more distributed form of capitalism than what we have right now. If you look at capitalism and communism, I mean specifically communism in Russia that we talk about as being communism, it's the other side of capitalism. So it's farther away from communism than even capitalism right now. It's a more distributed, more peer-to-peer form of capitalism that allows better price signals. It allows a better communication between the different nodes in our network that we call American society.
That's a really fascinating perspective, and I can definitely see where you're coming from, because it seems like right now the welfare and benefits and entitlements system is very top-down.
Yes.
They kind of dictate where the money goes. They dictate the government, that is, dictates where the money goes and what it can be spent on, and things like the WIC programs. There's very specific things that you're allowed to buy with this money. Whereas what you're saying is, no, let's give people a kind of lump sum of cash and then let them decide what's most meaningful for them to spend that cash on. Now, the technocrats in society are going to say, well, especially the people who already don't have a lot of money right now, they probably don't have a lot of money because they make poor decisions about where to put the money that they do have. So how do we know that they're not just going to squander this money that we're airdropping onto them?
Right. Well, what I like to say, as the saying goes, the proof is in the pudding. The proof in the pudding is in the eating. So this is talking about evidence. Where is the evidence? Where has this been tried? Let's not just think about what we think that people without money do. Let's look at what happens when we give people without money and see what actually happens. And we actually have a strong amount of evidence for this. Alaska in itself is already good evidence, where the Alaskan dividend has been functioning for decades, and we actually see great effects from this. But as far as specifically looking at the poor, and as far as their perceived inability to spend money, you look all over the world, like the Namibian income pilot is fascinating. I recently found out about a newer program. It wasn't a basic income program, but it took place in Bomi, Liberia. And this also, it actually it gave people, absolute poorest of the poor, it gave them enough money to be equivalent in incomes to the average GDP per capita in the country. So, imagine that, like just giving, finding some homeless people on the streets and giving them, $50,000 are about per capita GDP. Yeah. It's just an insane amount of money. And what they do with it? Well, get this, in Liberia, a third of these ultra poor started their own businesses. That to me is just an amazing finding. And we see this also in the basic income pilots in Namibia. We see it in the basic income pilots in India. It just seems to be it's a common thing that when people are given money, that it's prior to that there was a scarcity of money, that they weren't actually able to do anything. It wasn't that they screwed up and that they somehow ended up poor. It was that there's a certain scarcity of these resources, or access to these resources. And when you give people access to resources through money, what do? Well, they start their own businesses. They learn, they interact, they become more of a part of their community. They do not actually increase their alcohol or drug usage. This is a fascinating finding. It was a meta-analysis that was done over more than a dozen different studies, and there's just no support for people increasing goods such as alcoholism. They don't do that. What they do instead is they actually spend money on their housing. They spend money mostly on food. They spend it on their kids' educations. Just the stuff that seems like common sense.
Yeah.
When you read this stuff, you're just like, well, of course they spend it on that. But we don't think that. Like so many people think that they're not going to do that. Like, oh, why would you give money to a drug user? Because they're just going to spend it on drugs. Well, no, it's actually the opposite. Oftentimes, people without any other access to anything resort to drugs. And when you actually give people, when you actually increase the environments, they actually don't use drugs anymore. I mean, there's studies on this that have been done as far as even crack users. You think, that's impossible. Crack addicts aren't going to be able to make up their own minds. Well, even crack addicts have to eat. For some reason, we think that drug users don't eat every day, that they don't require 2,000 calories a day. Well, every human being requires about 2,000 calories a day in order to live. And guess what? They want to actually live, so they spend the money that they can find food. Yeah. It's just a normal finding.
Those are fascinating findings. Greg, do you have any follow-up questions on that topic?
Yeah, I'm curious. Is it really the case that the studies have generally been as flowery as you described them, or are there any edge cases that people should be aware of? Could you give us basically, in other words, like to not to rip off on Fox News, but a more fair and balanced kind of overview of the entire study landscape?
Oh, sure. Well, let's say one of the more interesting findings, I think it was from the India experiment. There were people that weren't happy with that, and they were the moneylenders. So it depending on who you're looking at, you are going to be people who don't like basic income. And in the case, again, it makes sense is that when you have a basic income, you don't take out as many loans, and you pay off the loans that you have, and you increase your savings. That's the findings. And of course, you've got moneylenders who are upset that hurt their business, and you also have people who require. So you've got farm owners who required farmhands to do their work for them. Well, because one of the common effects of basic income is entrepreneurship, then you had people becoming self-employed. So given the choice between self-employment and working for someone else, they opted for self-employment, and you had people that needed workers that had fewer workers to get. So again, in that case, they're going to need to pay higher wages. So depending on how you look at that, that can be a good thing or a bad thing. Now, I think most of us can recognize that as a positive thing, but of course, there are going to be people who think that's a negative thing.
That brings up an interesting question, which is that if we take that micro effect, okay, a farmer needs farmhands. The farmhands he used to hire are now using their basic income to employ themselves, and so therefore they have more bargaining power. Maybe all they're good at is really just being a farmhand, and so what they're doing is they're just collectivizing into a union or something like that to collectively bargain for higher wages because they can. They could always go and do something else with their basic income if they want, but since they know how to farmhand, they'll be farmhands. They'll just do it for higher prices. If we take that micro effect and we extrapolate it into the macro and assume that something like that is happening at the margins of every low cost or kind of unsexy kind of labor industry, if the goods or services providers, the farmers, the factory owners, etc., have to pay their workers higher prices because suddenly they have bargaining power, wouldn't that just raise the cost of the goods or services that are ultimately being provided in society and ultimately, in the long run, counteract this money airdrop that you're giving to people?
I've written about this as far as basic income and the effect on rising prices, actually, in an article, and I talk about this. In this particular example, this is one of the fascinating effects of basic is that, yes, people were going to have to increase wages for the jobs that people don't want to do. However, on the other hand, there are also going to be jobs that people really love doing, and those actually might go down. So there are going to be increases in wages and decreases in wages. So you're looking at what kind of business is this? Now, if there's a business that also gets to choose between, let's say right now they can automate and they could, let's say they can either right now choose to employ a worker for $20,000 a year, or they can choose to employ a robot for $25,000 a year. So right now they're not going to choose the robot. If suddenly they get the choice between a $25,000 a year robot or a $30,000 a year human, they're going to choose the robot.
Okay.
So what this is going to do is it's going to remove the current obstacles we have to automation. We want automation to accelerate, but only as long as everybody benefits. So this is a way for robots to become the better choice. And this is also because we know that technology does get cheaper, that especially over expanding in economies of scale, then you actually get the prices cheaper of robots. Those are going to get cheaper and cheaper over time, as is usual with technology, but humans aren't. Human labor doesn't get cheaper and cheaper over time unless there's a certain amount of desperation involved, which is what we're seeing right now, is a certain amount of desperation involved.
Right. There's a bit of a race to the bottom whereas
Yes.
people only have so much time in the day, but if there's an increasing amount of labor pool available due to unemployment and a decreasing amount of work, then human wages go down, even though the amount of time that we actually have to work remains the same. Whereas robots, they're just robots. They run as long as their batteries last, and and as you said, there are economies of scale. The more that are produced, the cheaper they get to produce. So that's really interesting. I want to talk a little bit about the implementation of this. What is the political reality of basic income? Is this a fringe idea? Do you actually think that it's something that's politically feasible? Does it start in a small area and then we try it at a national level in a decade or two? How do you see this actually working?
Well, I personally am of the opinion that we've already got sufficient evidence, especially even in the U.S. I mean, we did experiments in the 70s when we almost passed it then. And this is something a lot of people don't realize either, is that we did have something called the American Income Maintenance Experiments. And these took place in the late 60s, early 70s. And this took place all over the country in different places. They had to take place in Seattle and Denver, Gary, Indiana, rural Pennsylvania. Like there was a bunch of different locations they did this at. And what they really found was the work disincentive effect. And they found that there was a small work disincentive effect. And this varied according to how high that the amounts were, which again, they varied because they were testing this. They wanted to see, what were the effects based on different levels. So 50% of the poverty level, 100% of the poverty level, 150% of the poverty level. And they wanted to see what's the effect on married men, on married women, on unmarried single mothers. And so they wanted to see all of this. And what they found is that there was a small reduction in total hours of work, but not in the way that people actually freak out about. So if you don't read the actual details of these experiments, you think that, oh my gosh, let's so-and-so, this group decreased or whatever. And they don't understand that the people who decreased their hours by 20% were, let's say, a married 70s housewife. And so this was someone that, women had just come into the workforce and suddenly they had an extra money and they're like, well, I don't really need to work as much now. So they reduced their hours. And also when they reduce their hours by 20%, then it's like, well, if you're only working, say, 10 hours a week and you reduce your hours by 1 hour a week, then you've reduced it by 10%. 10% might sound big to somebody, but it's also only 1 hour. So what you want to look at is the primary earners, and these were the primary earning males in the 70s. They decreased their labor about 3%. Now, this actually wasn't still in reducing their actual hours worked at their job, but it was more that they spent a longer amount of time between jobs looking for jobs. So again, this is an effect that we want. We want people to find the jobs that are better suited to them. So if there's desperation, you're going to take the first job that comes along. And this is going to result in lower productivity, and it's also probably going to be a lower wage job. If someone has the freedom to wait and look for the better job, they can find a job that they're going to be more productive in and that they're going to earn higher incomes in.
Yeah. So you see that there are a lot of arguments in favor of it and a lot of evidence that points to the fact that this is something that could be politically feasible just because people's worst nightmares have not come true, at least to the degree that you think would pose any sort of political roadblocks. So going forward then, what do you see as a good path to implementing this at a society-wide scale? Is it limited to national borders? Is it something that do you think could extend to be transnational? How do you actually see this playing out?
Oh, sure. Well, I mean, there are so many different strategies, and I support like all of them. I mean, if you can come up with an idea that'll get people money that is not attached to work, then that's a good thing. I suggest And I believe that we really should look at the Alaska model. So I think that as a strategy, as also to show people that giving people money and especially showing them that it's theirs as their own commonwealth and that the effects are good, follow the Alaska model. So try to get states, and 26 states have the ability to do this, and they've done this for marijuana legalization in Colorado and Washington. What you want, get states, people need to get together and get signature petitions, get these initiatives going, and try to get a somewhat similar Alaska dividend in their countries, in their states. Get a Washington dividend, get a Colorado dividend. Get it so that everybody in these states gets, say, $500 a year, $1,000 a year, $1,500 a year. Last year, the Alaska dividend paid almost $2,000. So this is a good strategy.
Okay, so now, Greg, I brought you onto the show because you and I have had some interesting discussions as it relates to not only our work at the OK Turtles Foundation, but just on the topic of basic income, generally speaking. And you have some interesting ideas about how to implement basic income technologically without necessarily having to overcome the political hurdles that are required to get it to everybody on the planet. Do you think you could talk a little bit about some of your ideas there?
I think that Scott, in bringing up Alaska, points out that there are many different good ways of doing UBI, and doing it in a way that's government sponsored does require political will and convincing of that sort. There are ways to kind of sidestep that issue, which is the cryptocurrency route. And that has its own set of challenges, which are, I believe, are all overcomable. But on the other hand, as we're discovering in California, and as they're discovering in New York, just because you have a cryptocurrency doesn't mean that it is immune from the effects of politics. It's possible for legislatures to pass laws to try and regulate things that are very difficult to regulate, and they do this all the time. And that can still create roadblocks. So I think that cryptocurrencies are worth exploring for doing UBI. And at the same time, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't also be politically active in this sphere.
Do you have any ideas on that particular strategy, Scott?
Well, actually, what I'd like to talk about a version of this that's being done in Germany as a way of spreading the idea in Germany of basic income. And again, this is a way of getting around government, and I think it's a genius way of going about this. Okay, so what it's like is, how when you use a credit card, you get, depending on your credit card, you can get, say, 2% cash back.
Yeah.
So in Germany, they have, it's like a combination between that and, let's say, your card that you use at, say, your grocery store. So, before you pay for something, you scan your card and then you pay for it. So what this is between all these companies in Germany, they all use this card. So someone goes in, they scan their card, they pay for it, and then they end up later getting, say, a 1% cash back is what they have there. And because you're able to use this, all these different businesses, then, people can get, like, say, $50 cash back, $100 cash back at the end of the year. Now, what the people in Germany did is they copied this card. They duplicated one card. So it's like a hack of this system. So they created thousands of this one card with one account number. And so the people there can choose to use this card. And so, of course, because all these thousands of people are using one account number, this builds up money quickly. And what they're doing is they're setting up people with basic incomes using this. It's almost like a random system where people can win a basic income through the use of this card.
Wow. And
they've so far supplied about, over 10 people basic income so far. And I think in there it's at $10,000 per year. Not quite sure what the level is, somewhere around there. But they're giving people basic incomes based on this. So this is definitely a way that you can show that it's possible, and it gets around government, it's purely voluntary, and it provides basic incomes to people.
That's really fascinating. It kind of reminds me of this subreddit that I heard of the other day that does random airdrops of money onto people. Have you heard of this?
Yeah, I have heard about that. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think they're using Bitcoin. I'm pretty sure that's how it works, but everybody basically throws money into a pot, and then somebody who throws money into the pot randomly wins the lottery, basically, and they get
Right.
a bunch of all of the money. It's just really fascinating, some of the things that people are doing to try and implement this themselves on a small scale. Now, one thing that you are doing is you have a Patreon campaign
Yes.
that is basically for all of your different content that you produce on Basic Income and the different community leadership work that you do. You say, hey, if you support my work on Basic Income, then I would like you to be a patron of my Patreon campaign and pledge to provide me, essentially, with a basic income. And your Patreon campaign is interesting because what you're doing is you yourself have taken a pledge and you are encouraging other Patreon creators to take a pledge to cap the income that they receive from Patreon and pay the rest, everything over the cap, forward to other creators. Can you talk a little bit about that program and what inspires you to do that?
Yeah. So I call that idea the big Patreon creator pledge. And what I want to do is I want to encourage people to do as I'm doing and crowdfund their own basic incomes. And I'm amazed actually so far. It feels so good to be supported by people who really like your work. And I feel like I'm already feeling the effects of a full basic income. I mean, people are just I'm doing what I'm doing because I'm passionate about it. It's something that I love doing, and it's rewarding. There's intrinsic motivation involved, and people are enabling me to do that. And that's what I hope that we can do with basic income, is people actually pursue what they want to do. With the Patreon pledge, is I want people to take the same pledge to create, and they don't even need to specifically make content for basic income. They can do anything they most want to do, but it just needs to be capped at on Patreon. I have it as $1,111 per month because they take about 10%. But $1,000 a month is what I feel is a good basic income to start at in the U.S. Mm-hmm. So I will stop at $1,000 a month, and I hope other people will stop at $1,000 a month, and then we can share anything over that with each other so that we can create more people with more basic incomes.
Kind of one of the last questions that I have about basic income kind of relates to this idea of a cap or a floor, depending on how you look at it.
Yes, floor.
And that is that the cost of living is different in different areas. So $1,000 might be suitable as a basic income to cover basic expenses for some people in some areas, but maybe it's nowhere close for other people, like people in New York or San Francisco or other places that are among the highest costs of living in the world. How do you kind of reconcile that discrepancy?
What I believe is that right now, because of the fact that we are requiring people to work in order to get an income, that people are condensed, they're concentrated around areas of employment. You've got, major cities have gone, it's much more expensive to live there because everyone needs to live there. If you create a national level basic income, then because people no longer have to live where they currently have to live, there's going to be a decrease in the high density areas. You're going to see people going to less dense areas because you're going to want to save your income. I mean, no one wants to spend $800 of their $1,000 a month basic income on rent. So the question becomes, if you're in a two-person household, that's double. So many people are already, like in New York, they're already sharing rent. You've got 3 people, 4 people in a place. All these people have basic incomes or will have basic incomes. It suddenly makes it's a different picture. If you want to live alone in a very expensive area, then that's more of a choice you have to look at.
Yeah.
It seems to me that if you want to live alone and not work for any extra money, then it should be somewhat difficult, right? I mean, most people in New York aren't employed. And those who aren't employed are going to be better off with basic income. They're going to get money without having to jump through any hoops, without having any bureaucracy, and they actually can earn incomes on top of that. Whereas right now, a lot of the administration is involved in making sure that people aren't working, which doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
So again, like you said, it's a difference between a cap and a floor. People are far better off with a floor. You have entire days free. You have zero obligation, 0 hours of obligation to do anything else. What if you have a basic income? So you got an open schedule. You can get a job. You can do part-time work. You can do freelance work. You can do gig economy work. There's all these ways of earning more incomes above it than what's possible right now.
Those are all really good points, and we could certainly continue having this discussion. It's a very fascinating topic to me and to Greg as well, I'm sure. But we're all out of time today. Scott, Greg, I want to thank you both for joining me for this special episode of P2P Connects Us, and I look forward to continuing the conversation later in the future.
Right. Well, thanks for having me.
Thank you, John.
Listeners can find links to all of Scott's work on his website at scottsantens.com. That's SCOTTSANTENS. Thanks for tuning in to episode 15 of the P2P Connects Us podcast. If you have any comments or questions, you can reach me through the contact page on my website at p2pconnects.us. Till next time.